Welcome to Israel Explained, where we help you understand Israel, Israel's neighbors, and provide you with context to understand the Middle East. My name is Avery Chenault, and I'm joined by Passage's resident scholar, Josiah McGee. In November 2024, after a year of war in Gaza and Lebanon, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. These arrest warrants accuse both of these officials of failing to protect civilians and even intentionally targeting civilians through starvation. This is just one of the many controversies surrounding Israel's protection of civilians. Many people on social media or other platforms have accused Israel of genocide. The Biden administration has repeatedly threatened to withhold military aid to Israel if Israel does not meet the administration's various commands. So today, we're discussing why Israel's protection of civilians is so complicated, and does Israel actually protect civilians? So Josiah, this is a highly controversial issue, particularly online. I think on social media, this is maybe one of the predominant issues that people are discussing is Israel's protection of civilians. So can you tell us a little bit about where is this coming from?
Yeah, I think people who sort of reject this question or the accusations that Israel does not protect civilians are probably going to argue something like these accusations are founded in hatred of Israel, not in reality or truth. They are false allegations. People who are making the accusations would probably argue that they really believe these statements are true, that they are based in reality. This is fact. It's very difficult to convince either side of this argument that their arguments are not based in truth and reality. That doesn't mean that every accusation is true or false. So I do think it is important that most people on either side are going to assume this is sort of a black and white, but that's not necessarily the case. It is a bit more complicated because nobody's perfect. I don't think anyone's arguing that Israel has perfectly protected every civilian and done everything absolutely correctly over the course of this war. Neither is it true that Israel is, purely out to get all the civilians and is committing genocide. So it's just a more nuanced, complicated reality than that. At the same time, I think it's important to be very precise about the facts. What do we know? What do we not know? And the way that we characterize the facts, the way that we interpret them. It's a lot easier to do that, I think, if you take a look at specific examples rather than making broad generalizations. And that's probably part of the issue, why people are so entrenched on one side of this issue or the other, making very black and white arguments that are just not true, like Israel's committing genocide, because you can only make an argument like that if you're over generalizing the situation and you're not being very precise about the way that you understand, talk about, and characterize the facts on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to talk about a few examples today to help contextualize our conversation and provide more context for this important issue. So something that people commonly criticize Israel of is attacking civilian spaces. So many people frequently accuse Israel of attacking these civilian spaces. So my question is attacking a civilian space actually an attack on civilians?
This is not going to sound intuitive at all, but not necessarily. And that, I think, is one of the harder to understand concepts. One would assume that an attack on any sort of civilian space, like a home or a school or a hospital, is an attack on civilians. It's inappropriate, shouldn't happen. But reality, again, is just a little bit more complicated than that. So the reason why is because a civilian space is considered that if it is occupied solely by civilians and used for civilian purposes. If a civilian space is occupied by an armed group, anyone with military intent, and is using it for their own purposes in order to either build a defensive position or to carry out attacks from within that civilian space, it's not necessarily considered protected civilian space any longer, because at that point it's been transformed into a military space or a military target, not a civilian space. It is very frequently an issue that comes up when Israel is engaging in and around different hospitals, for example. So technically under international law, hospitals have some sort of special status. You're really not supposed to shoot into a hospital or something like that. That is very not okay under the Geneva Conventions and various international laws about the way that we conduct war. But at the same time, the conventions also state that even a hospital is not considered protected. It loses some of its special status if someone is using it for, violent purposes, for military purposes. And in Israel's argument in many cases is that that's why they're going into these hospitals. Israel does in fact have proof that over the last year, Hamas actually used hospitals to carry out a variety of actions which would disqualify that building from being considered a purely civilian space or facility. So, for example, they have used hospitals to hide within and shoot at soldiers. They've used them to store weapons. You can't put a bunch of rifles or let alone rockets inside a hospital and then claim that it's a civilian space only. You're obviously using it for something other than civilian purposes. And they've also, in many cases, used them. There's some evidence of this. There's even surveillance footage of this, CCTV footage of this, of them hiding hostages in hospitals. So there's just clear examples of where Israel has been able to make a credible argument that the reason why they're operating inside hospitals is not because they're, they feel like operating in civilian context, but because they have to be there because the hospital has been transformed by Hamas into a military space and a military target. It's also very obvious at this point that first Hamas and then Hezbollah were, Israel discovered they were using civilian homes to hide weapons, to fire rockets. There's a case where they found a cruise missile in someone's home. This is in southern Lebanon, rather. Hezbollah was doing this, which is just crazy. And they've also used these same to conceal tunnel networks. So the Gaza tunnel, which, for example, end of August, there was a very famous case, August 2024, where 6 hostages were executed in a tunnel network underneath Gaza. And they were very well-known names, young people full of life. It was a very tragic story. And it became clear after a little bit more time when the news started to come out and the details were shared that the entrance to the tunnel that they were executed in was basically inside what looked like either a school or a playground complex. There was pictures, murals on the wall of Disney characters, that kind of thing. So it's just really crazy that Hamas and Hezbollah were both doing this, concealing all of these places where they were either storing weapons, using them to attack Israel, or using them to hide the hostages inside this very, what would otherwise be very obviously civilian contexts. There's even video footage of Hamas using ambulances or other humanitarian vehicles to smuggle fighters and weapons in and out of different parts of the Gaza Strip or even out of the Gaza Strip. So it's really a very serious issue, but one that we need to understand, because this is important context to understand. This is what Israel means when it says that Hamas or Hezbollah uses civilians as human shields. And when they do that, it means that if Israel feels like it is necessary to take action against a building that would normally be used for civilian purposes, it doesn't mean they're attacking civilians. It means that they're having to work around the human shields that Hamas and Hezbollah are using to protect themselves.
Absolutely. I think that something that is really crucial to this conversation today is understanding Hamas's and Hezbollah's use of civilian spaces, like we just talked about, in warfare. And I think that whenever you think about a hospital being attacked or a school being attacked or whatever the civilian space is, many people would say that that is outrageous, because if Hamas was not there, that would most certainly be outrageous. But that is a very important key to understanding our conversation today, is understanding the distinction of when those civilian spaces are being used in warfare. So I appreciate you helping us make that distinction. So something else that I want to talk about is Israel's obligation to not harm civilians.
Right.
So can you speak a little bit more on that and just speak to the obligations that Israel does and does not have when it comes to civilians?
So the fact that Hamas and Hezbollah use civilian human shields doesn't absolve Israel of its responsibilities. It makes Israel's job significantly more difficult, but Israel does still have responsibilities and obligations towards the civilians that are in those places that they have to work. Israel has an obligation to not intentionally or indiscriminately attack civilians, meaning that you have to do your best to hit military targets and to avoid just firing in random directions without knowing what you're going to hit. You have to do your best to not intentionally harm civilians, obviously. You need to be looking for military targets instead. And unfortunately, the unfortunate and ironic reality is that they have to do this despite the fact that Hamas and Hezbollah do not do this. That being said, it should also do its best to prevent the accidental deaths of civilians. So it has an obligation to not just avoid purposefully killing civilians, but also trying to avoid accidental deaths of civilians when it can. Unfortunately, the nature of urban combat, which is most of what Israel's been fighting, or I should say combat in residential areas. So in Gaza, it's a very urban combat situation. In southern Lebanon, it's been more residential. It's not like big cities, but you are fighting in towns and villages and residential areas. And the nature of both of those types of combat or combat environments is that you're never going to accomplish zero civilian casualties. So Israel's obligations have to be viewed less as they're not allowed to kill any civilians, and more so that they have to figure out how to minimize civilian casualties to the degree that it is possible to do so, because it's just a very tragic but unfortunate reality that war does sometimes kill civilians, and no one is expected to be able to avoid civilian casualties entirely. It's about doing what you have to do to make sure that you minimize them to the greatest degree possible.
Absolutely. So can you speak to what sort of measures Israel takes to minimize civilian casualties?
Yeah, so I think before we get to that, there's one more thing I think I want to mention as far as sort of what the standard is in terms of how many civilian casualties is too much, and then maybe we can talk about how Israel tries to sort of live up to that standard. There's a doctrine within just war theory, which basically it's referred to as proportionality. I think it's a little bit initially misleading if you don't fully understand what it means, because it doesn't mean that, okay, Hamas kills one person, Israel can kill one person, and we call it good. That's not at all how this works. Proportionality within military doctrine means that you are allowed to conduct your operations presuming that there is a valid and realistic military objective to be met, to be attained. And civilian casualties are considered too many if they are excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantages that you can actually obtain. So it assumes, again, that some civilians, unfortunately, are going to be the casualties of war. The important question is, have you considered every alternative first? Have you done the best that you can to achieve the minimum number of casualties possible? And are you actually achieving something important? Are you actually meeting military objectives, or are you just killing people without accomplishing anything? That's basically what proportionality means. As far as what Israel does to try to sort of live up to that standard, a lot of it has to do with, one, laying out, strong military objectives, realistic military objectives, and a case for why military action is necessary. The second thing is doing what they can to try to give civilians a chance, essentially, to avoid the conflict if at all possible. So in the case of an airstrike, for example, let's use this because I think it comes up all the time, this controversy over Israel's airstrike and bombing campaigns. In the case of an airstrike, you can try to do something like use precision bombs, which allow you to pinpoint to the greatest degree possible, given what technology allows, a military target and distinguish between that and a civilian target. But that can still be a somewhat inexact science. We're talking about explosives, so stuff still happens. It's not a perfect solution. There's only so much you can do when dropping a missile on a building. You can provide additional warnings, which Israel often does. So they often call ahead or drop leaflets to sort of warn people. But that really only works if you can warn people without warning the person that you're actually trying to eliminate.
Mm-hmm.
Something that is very difficult to do. And sometimes you can't call ahead. And so sometimes civilians will still wind up in the crossfire because Israel can't warn the person that they're trying to eliminate
Mm-hmm.
that they're about to launch an airstrike. You can also ask someone to evacuate. That can be a very complicated issue, but it's
Mm-hmm.
something that Israel has done repeatedly over the last year, is ask both citizens or residents of Gaza and in southern Lebanon
Mm-hmm.
to evacuate different areas that they're trying to clear of terrorists and their infrastructure.
So, can you share with us a little bit more about evacuations and why exactly evacuations are so complicated?
Evacuations are complicated because it's incredibly disruptive. Imagine trying to live in a war zone and just take care of your family and all the complications that come with it. Trying not to go outside, trying to be safe, trying to avoid any sort of conflict, but also having to go out and do what you need to in order to work, to get food, to do all these things. And then someone comes and tells you, like, you have to leave. You have to pick up whatever you can carry and take your entire family and leave. And it's not clear if and when you're going to be able to come back.
Mm-hmm.
Horribly disruptive and a very unpopular tactic for protecting civilians, honestly, because it is a really tragic reality to have to live
Mm-hmm.
that life. The other factor to the evacuations I think makes them complicated is some would argue that an evacuation is an attempt by Israel to accomplish ethnic cleansing, to basically commit a war crime by clearing an entire area of Palestinians that they don't want there or whatever. That, I think, is very premature to be making the argument that Israel's committing ethnic cleansing. But the challenge is it's necessary if Israel wants to avoid those accusations that eventually those individuals will have to be able to return, or
Mm-hmm.
Israel's going to have to explain why it's not possible for them to return. And if Israel were to, let's say, force every Palestinian out of the Gaza Strip and then not let them come back, then in essence that would be an example of ethnic cleansing,
Mm-hmm.
and there would be some pretty serious consequences under international law. So when Israel engages in these tactics, it's very effective at protecting civilians from immediate harm, but it invites a lot of criticism.
Mm-hmm.
And so it invites a lot of criticism and controversy in the process. And long term, it creates a lot of issues that Israel has to manage in terms of how are we going to care for these people long term? How are we going to get them back?
Mm-hmm.
What are we going to do with them in the meantime? It's just complicated.
Yeah. So, something that I want to discuss a little bit more is the issue of humanitarian aid.
Yeah.
So, on both sides of this conflict, humanitarian aid is an issue. And it's extremely important in conflicts like these because, like you just discussed, we have these people that are having to evacuate from place to place within the Gaza Strip or within southern Lebanon as well. And these people, they do need assistance. They need humanitarian aid as they're enduring these extremely difficult circumstances. So, I want to hear your thoughts on why exactly humanitarian aid is getting so much attention from both sides.
Unfortunately, just because of the nature of the way that Palestinian society was built in the Gaza Strip under Hamas, Hamas's inattention to the economy of Gaza and to basic public works, that sort of thing. Even before October 7, humanitarian aid was important.
Mm-hmm.
There were a number of international organizations providing humanitarian aid into Gaza to support families, in large part because they needed it. There was a real genuine need for it,
Mm-hmm.
in particular when the unemployment rate is so high in the Gaza Strip and the economy is so weak. Post October 7, it's just exponentially more important that humanitarian aid is available because the economy is just in absolute tatters. People's homes, businesses have been destroyed in many cases. And there's a serious breakdown in authority and governance in the Gaza Strip. So it's key that someone has to sort of step up and take control of the situation and make sure that people have basic needs being met. Many people in Gaza rely on regular shipments of supplies, especially those who have been displaced or are evacuees from different areas. And that means that it gets a lot of attention from people who are critical of Israel and its conduct of the war, or even of the war itself in the Gaza Strip. On the other hand, Israel knows very well that prior to October 7, Hamas used humanitarian shipments for smuggling purposes. On the border with Egypt, for example, there's tunnels large enough for you to drive a truck through where Hamas was smuggling things in and out of the Gaza Strip. So it's really clear that Hamas had long-standing practices of engaging in smuggling. And as Israel conducted its operation in Gaza, and they found different places where Hamas operatives or leadership had been staying in the Gaza Strip during the war, they also found these large stockpiles of different goods. There's video of Sinwar, for example, taking underground before October 7, large stockpiles of different goods, groceries, television, flat screen, all kinds of things. So it was very, very clear that the people of Gaza need humanitarian aid. Even before October 7, this was clear, and after. Before and after October 7, it was also very, very clear that humanitarian aid is part of the lifeline that supports Hamas and allows Hamas to continue operating in the Gaza Strip. So if Israel is going to totally defeat Hamas, they have to cut those supply lines. They have to suffocate the organization so they can't continue committing terrorism. The question is, can they do that without preventing the humanitarian aid from reaching the innocent people who still really need it?
Wow. That's a very, very complex issue. So something else I want to talk about today is the International Criminal Court accusing Israel of starving Gazans. So this accusation of starvation is extremely serious. I want to hear your thoughts on this issue. Is Israel actually intentionally starving people in Gaza?
No, but I think it is a really serious issue. Like you said, this has to be taken very seriously. These are very serious allegations. I think, unfortunately, Israel didn't do itself a lot of favors in the way that it conducted the first few weeks of the war, because when it became clear in the chaos of the first, let's say, 2 to 3 weeks after October 7 in 2023, all Israel knew was that there had been this massive attack for up to, I think, a week after October 7. There were still an unknown number of terrorists they had to find inside Israel. And they were still trying to figure out exactly how many hostages had been taken to Gaza. But it was hundreds. So it was a very serious situation Israel found themselves in. And one of the things that they did immediately was basically say, okay, in order to stabilize the situation, we're going to institute a siege on the Gaza Strip. They threatened to use siege tactics that would have really inflicted some pretty serious damage on the economy of the Gaza Strip and the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, in an attempt to basically force Hamas to immediately release the hostages and not create this prolonged hostage crisis. I get it, but it was very quickly over because people very quickly became clear, and people made it clear to Israel, like, you can't do that. Like, you can't just cut off the water and electricity to the Gaza Strip. You're going to have to, unfortunately, you're going to have to fight a long war to get these hostages back. And that's exactly what's happened, is Israel's been forced to fight a very long war of attrition. That being said, despite some of the initial reactions to the events of October 7 and the claims like we're going to lay siege to Gaza and do what we have to do to get our people back, it's not what Israel actually did. If you look at Israel's actual behavior and the actions that it's taken over the last year, it hasn't done that. It has allowed a great deal of humanitarian aid in, although there is a pretty consistent debate over whether or not it's enough. And there's really, I think, two problems right now that make this humanitarian issue so challenging. First one is how much aid is necessary and who's controlling how much aid gets in. And the second is how it's being distributed. So Israel and the US and the UN have gone back and forth many times about how much aid is necessary in order to sustain the population in sort of the economy of the Gaza Strip, although it's basically ruined. But what do you need in order to just maintain life in the Gaza Strip? How much humanitarian aid is necessary? They've gone back and forth. The items allowed, the amount allowed, have consistently changed based on needs and or definition of humanitarian aid. Like what qualifies as humanitarian aid.
Yeah.
There's also been, I think, some recent progress made. I wanted to note that at the time of recording this, Israel is meeting not just their own standards, but also most international standards or demands for how much humanitarian aid, what types of humanitarian aid. They're allowing things in that they weren't originally willing to allow in because the international community demands it, of course, even though Israel disagrees that it's necessary aid. The second issue, however, is distribution. So Israel's allowing things in, and the common argument that Israel is preventing aid from getting in is really not true. What winds up happening in most cases is that there's some pretty serious distribution problems. Like trucks will make it through the crossing into the Gaza Strip, and then they won't be sent anywhere. They'll be stuck there waiting for someone to tell them where they're supposed to go. And then if they do get somewhere, it's not effectively reaching the right people. So there's a lot of issues right now over jurisdiction and who's responsible to monitor the humanitarian aid once it makes it into Gaza, who's responsible to make sure that it gets into the right hands. And a lot of it is frequently stolen either by Hamas, because again, they have a long history of doing this, or by different organized crime families even, or gangs, or just random groups of people who are desperate and are stealing humanitarian aid. And what winds up happening is that it's just kind of a state of anarchy, honestly, in Gaza, where there's enough aid for everyone, but it's not necessarily getting to the right people because people are taking too much or stealing it or destroying it or whatever, because there's just no clear chain of authority in the Gaza Strip right now. In November 2024, there was an example, actually, the news story that came out that nearly 100 trucks were looted. In one day, nearly 100 trucks were looted in what the UN called the largest loss of humanitarian aid since the war started. It's tragic. These people desperately need these materials and supplies, and it is getting into Gaza. It's just not getting to the people because people are taking advantage of the situation for their own purposes.
Yeah. Like you just said, it is extremely tragic, just the level of desperation and suffering that has come out of this situation. I want to talk a little bit now about Israel's obligation for Palestinian civilians. So what obligations do they have to make sure Palestinian civilians are being taken care of?
They have varying levels of responsibility, and it really depends, I think, on a couple of variables. So one, do they control the area, or does Hamas, or in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority, or whatever? And then, do they have any viable alternatives who have agreed to take care of the civilians in the area? So if Israel controls the area and not Hamas, then you're responsible for what happens inside that area. If Hamas controls the area, Hamas is responsible. If Israel controls the area, not Hamas, there is a way in which Israel could transfer responsibility, but only if someone's agreed to accept that transfer of responsibility. So, for example, if hypothetically Israel agreed to transfer responsibility to Egypt for certain areas in Gaza, or the UAE or Jordan have sent different supplies to Gaza to try to help the situation or whatever. But if Israel controls an area and doesn't have alternatives, then yeah, technically they are responsible for what happens inside that zone that they control. The closer to the end of the war we get, the more of an issue this is going to become. And Israel is going to get to a point where it doesn't necessarily formally occupy the entire Gaza Strip, but it will have large bases of operation in the Gaza Strip. And if Hamas is totally destroyed, then Israel will effectively be the only power left. There'll be a power vacuum where it's a bunch of gangs and rival groups, and Israel's going to be the only military power in the Gaza Strip. And at that point, you basically are kind of in charge of what happens there. Again, unless they find some alternatives to help them manage the Gaza Strip. I think the concern at this point that is still being addressed is that the Israeli political establishment is still having difficulty settling on a good day after plan for if they do succeed in destroying Hamas, which honestly I'm not sure is realistic at this point, but if they do, then what?
Yeah.
Will you allow the Palestinian Authority to take over?
Mm-hmm.
Will you allow some other Arab country to take over? Can you convince another Arab country to take over? Are you going to do it yourselves? Like, who's going to run the Gaza Strip and take care of people if you do succeed in actually totally destroying the group that's currently in charge, which is Hamas?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just hard. I don't think they have really been able to come to a good day after plan yet that they can all agree on, the Israeli politicians. And it means that Israel will effectively probably be responsible for most day-to-day affairs. There's a note from an article, a note made by the former defense minister in an article a few weeks ago, who argued that Israel's commitment to secure and distribute humanitarian aid when the time comes is basically a euphemism for a military occupation. So while Israel doesn't want that, it's not good for Israel or Israel's security. If they can't find an alternative, then yeah, they're going to have to. They're going to have to stay and make sure that humanitarian aid is distributed effectively.
Yeah.
And that means that they're going to basically have to occupy Gaza until they find someone else to take over.
Yeah.
It's not pretty, but that's just kind of the reality that faces Israel until a better option makes itself clear.
Something I have seen, an accusation that I have seen made against Israel since the early days of this war, is that Israel is committing genocide. This is an idea that is so present on social media. It's absolutely everywhere. At protests, you're almost guaranteed to see a sign or hear a chant regarding Israel and genocide.
Yeah.
So I want to ask, what are your thoughts on how Christians should respond when someone is accusing Israel of genocide?
It's so hard because genocide is such a loaded term.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think people appreciate fully the history of the term, that it was even after the horrors of many centuries of conflict during the ancient periods, medieval periods, in which horrifying things were done. We didn't even have this word until after the Holocaust. It was used after the Holocaust as a way of describing the Holocaust because people thought the English vocabulary didn't have a good enough word for it yet. And so we had to come up with something new to describe this level of crime against humanity. And nowadays, it's used very flippantly, the term genocide. People don't attribute the same gravity to the term genocide that it was originally created for. It was created to convey a sense of gravity that the English language didn't have a word for. But it's almost the opposite now, where it's just used to describe conflicts when people disagree with the way that a conflict is being fought or a war is being conducted, which I think is very unfortunate because it does not allow us to seriously grapple with cases in which ethnic cleansing or genocide is actually occurring.
Absolutely.
It creates this sort of like boy cries wolf scenario, honestly, in some situations where people have a hard time telling the difference and then have a hard time engaging when we really need people to engage around serious cases of genocide. That being said, I think it requires you to hold intention to two mindsets and two sides of our brain, if you will. Like, you have to engage both the logic and the compassion, because if you only have one and not the other, then I think we're going to miss the boat pretty drastically on this issue. So on the logical side, it really, I'm going to be honest, like I just don't find it logical or realistic that genocide is actually occurring. I understand that there are cases in which the Israeli Defense Forces may have acted without enough caution, for example. And again, I think it's important not to overgeneralize, but on a case-by-case basis, I'm willing to entertain the argument that, okay, there are specific cases in which the IDF is in fact investigating actions by soldiers that it considers to be inappropriate.
Yeah.
And I have no problem having those conversations or evaluating those cases. I do find it very difficult to buy the argument that genocide is occurring, because if you look at it, if you take a step back and just look at the numbers, for example, look at it purely objectively, which is hard to do, it just doesn't add up, because the civilian to combatant ratio, if we accept the numbers that are being given to us by the Gaza Health Ministry, which most people assume is some sort of front for Hamas, you're looking at a civilian to combatant ratio that Israel argues is 2-1, maybe 3-1, more likely 1.5 or 2-1 in terms of, 2 civilians killed for every combatant killed. And that's horrifying that so many civilians have been killed. But in the context of global conflict and the rest of the wars that are being fought around the world, the global average is somewhere closer to 8 or 9-1 civilian to combatant ratios in conflict. So it just doesn't add up that the number of civilians being killed would be lower than the global average, and at the same time Israel would be committing genocide. If they were trying to commit genocide, they're doing a horribly ineffective job. They're really bad at it if that's what they're trying to do. And of course, I think given the scope of destruction, it's fair to question individual incidents. Again, as we've mentioned, the IDF is investigating some specific incidents, but an organized campaign of ethnic destruction just doesn't seem to be in the picture. If you just even the demographic trends in terms of like population fluctuations in the Gaza Strip, decline and growth, overall the population is not. It is not the victim of a ethnic cleansing campaign. That being said, that's a very purely logical, emotionless way of looking at things, which is not how the world works. So I think as Christians, we also have to think about this compassionately. We need to be mindful of the fact that even if they're not victims of a horrifying crime against humanity, they are suffering.
Absolutely.
Because of what's happening. And that doesn't mean that we have to validate claims that are untrue in order to be compassionate. It does mean, I think, and this is something, if I can, speak to our Christians watching this, one thing that bothers me sometimes about the way that Christians talk about this conflict and the way that it's been fought in Gaza is there's a tendency to ridicule or mock the suffering of Palestinians. That's not how the Bible teaches us to act or think about or speak about issues that relate to human suffering. Like, every human is made in the image of God. Absolutely. There is inherent worth and dignity, and their suffering is not something to laugh at or to praise or to celebrate. We should mourn the suffering that has happened instead, and the evil that brought it about. It includes Hamas and its responsibility for the war that's being fought, the fact that they started it. It includes the fact that war, although it is a necessary evil, it's still an evil. It's not a good thing that we should celebrate. It's something we should mourn, the fact that it exists in our world today. And we should pray that it would be over soon.
Absolutely.
That someday evil will be eradicated. And as Christians, that ultimately means praying for Jesus' return.
Yes.
Because that's how we know that these sufferings and these wars and trials will eventually end.
Yes. I especially love what you said about holding compassion and logic together. I think that's absolutely crucial when we're having these conversations about civilian suffering in Gaza or people accusing Israel of genocide. And I think it's really important when we're thinking about these extremely difficult and heavy topics that I think it can be easy to just think of it as like civilians and just group them all together like civilians. But like you said, every civilian is made in the image of God, and every civilian has a story and a family and hopes and dreams, and they're made in the image of God, just like you said. And I think it's so crucial that we really bring that into this conversation when we're thinking about these very difficult and serious topics. So I really appreciate you bringing that into the conversation today and guiding us through these very complex issues. For our audience, I hope that this was insightful for you. I hope that you gained some clarity and learned a lot about this very crucial issue. If you have any questions about what was discussed today, please leave a comment down below and we'd be happy to answer your question. Also, check out the description below for more resources or to learn more about passages. And if you're looking for more content, be sure to follow us on Instagram for more content related to Israel and the Middle East. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.